The 1960s really was the final great decade for the British motorcycle industry. Even in the 60s, though, the writing was on the wall primarily from Japanese influence and even more specifically from Honda.
And you can run around all day on a nickel's worth of gas. Honda, world's biggest seller.
Honda had something to offer that no other motorcycle company had. Literally a motorcycle for everyone, from the tiny little Z50, perfect for the budding rider wanting to just rip around the forests and learn how to ride, to the super accessible Super Cub, which was literally for everyone, to the arrival of the great Honda CB750, arguably the first superbike. At times throughout the 70s, Honda was offering a motorcycle of almost every kind at almost every cc. One need only flip through a Honda pamphlet from this time to see what I'm talking about. A few production motorcycles from Honda really stand out from this period as unique. You have bikes like the CB450, for example, a double overhead cam parallel twin using torsion bars instead of traditional coil springs for the valves, topping out at over 100 miles per hour and revving to a whopping 11,000 RPMs, which is quite a lot for a twin, especially for this time. But for me, the oddest and perhaps most impressive motorcycle from Honda in the 70s was the CB354. This is a motorcycle that makes almost no sense, sold poorly, was overpriced and underperforming, but man was it awesome. By 1972, Honda had figured out quite a lot. They'd been selling more motorcycles than any other company since the mid-60s, and more importantly, they'd proven that they could innovate and push boundaries, namely in the area of multi-cylinder engine configurations. So in the late 1960s, a 4-cylinder motorcycle engine was little more than a pipe dream for virtually all of the major motorcycle manufacturers, even the Japanese companies. Triumph's new 3-cylinder Trident was fast for its day, no doubt, and for a British company, it was certainly a step in the right direction, but it was completely overshadowed just weeks later by the release of Honda's 4-cylinder CB750. Only one more cylinder than the Trident, but way more motorcycle. The Trident didn't have near the performance, it was too heavy, and in comparison it would have felt antiquated. With a 4-speed gearbox, drum brakes, pushrod valves, no electric start, the CB70 had everything a rider could ever want, and some things that riders didn't even know that they wanted. Oh, and it also didn't leak oil everywhere like all the other big British bikes. The 4-cylinder CB750 wasn't a perfect bike, and even Honda was forced to innovate going into the 70s as the CB750 was kind of overshadowed by bikes from Kawasaki. The Japanese companies just began releasing more and more impressive 4-cylinder machines, but the CB750 is where it all started. And in almost every way, the CB750 truly was the motorcycle of the future when it arrived in 1969. But for this video, it's what Honda did next that I think is so interesting. See, Honda was already making the best smaller and medium displacement motorcycles that you could buy, but Honda took aim at the British once again by taking the blueprint of the CB750 and applying it to the middleweight category. Triumph and BSA lived and died by their 650 and 500cc motorcycles. Honda had made those larger British bikes obsolete in terms of overall performance and features and affordability, and now Honda was making a smaller 4-cylinder motorcycle, a 500, that would ultimately take out Triumph's iconic 500. The CB500 was released in 71, and Triumph discontinued their 500 just a few years later. It had been some 35 years since Edward Turner had turned the motorcycling world upside down with this iconic 500cc parallel twin, a configuration no doubt copied by Honda in their early days, but now Honda was the company that was making moves. If the CB750 was years ahead of the big British bikes, the CB500 was light years ahead of the middleweight British bikes. I know this because I own a Triumph 500 from the late 60s, which, by the way, was really no different than the last Triumph 500s that came out in the early 70s. Oh, and I now also own a Honda CB504. So whether you're talking about performance, power, usability, features, even small things like the way the tank comes off. My Triumph's tank is bolted on like it had been since the beginning of motorcycles, but the CB500 tank slides onto the frame with these rubber mounts. There's no unbolting anything. It's incredibly easy. And perhaps most importantly, the CB500 wasn't nearly as heavy as the CB750, and because of this, though it did lack the power, it handled so much better, weighed significantly less, and was only slightly slower in a quarter mile, roughly 0.8 of a second slower than the CB750 according to Kaplan Cycles. The CB500 was arguably the better motorcycle, so Honda had now made two successful inline-4 platforms that could be credited basically with taking down entire industries. And then Honda did something weird. They decided to make a motorcycle that nobody wanted, the CB354, the smallest displacement 4-cylinder motorcycle to date. This was so much more than just an evolution of their new revolutionary inline-4 platform. Honda had a history of making impressive small capacity multi-cylinder machines, most notably the 6-cylinder RC166, but Honda had never really considered taking these small displacement 4 and 6-cylinder race bikes to the public. The CB350F was essentially just like its bigger brothers, but being a 350cc engine meant that each of the 4 pistons was no larger than a small pill bottle. The bike had 4 carburetors and 4x4 exhaust, just like the bigger bikes. It was really the same configuration as the CB750 and CB500, but because it was so small, the bike was even more complex. And in comparison with other 350s on the market, including Honda's CB350 Twin, it was a lot of bike with little to show for it. It made a meager 32 horsepower, which was actually less power than the CB350 Twins from Honda, and it was slower because it also weighed more. The CB750 and 504s were a step forward, so what in the world was Honda doing with this bike, this 350cc inline 4? It wasn't competitive, it didn't sell well, it was overpriced, and Honda threw it in the trash a few years after its release. But out of all of the motorcycles the company designed and produced and sold leading up to this point, Soichiro Honda actually said that the CB350F was his favorite motorcycle, primarily because of the experience riding it. It was completely different than anything else you could buy, even the 500 and 754s. It was the smoothest motorcycle in the world. For those wanting a smaller motorcycle, there was nothing like this bike. Even the best-selling CB350 Twin, though head and shoulders above most of the competition out there, that was still a basic motorcycle at its core. The CB354 was anything but basic. Sometimes you can't always boil down the value of a machine simply to the specs or performance or features, because on paper, the bike wasn't great. Sometimes a motorcycle is special because it's born out of passion. Honda did not need this bike to make sense or to have guaranteed projected sales for them to build it. They just wanted to build something really cool, and so they did it. And Mr. Honda happened to be very involved with every aspect of Honda motorcycling at this point. He was very involved with all the engineering. He was down in the factory, making big decisions. He wasn't just like some executive sitting in a nice chair somewhere. And he wasn't a bean counter. He was passionate about motorcycles. Though completely new as a production motorcycle, a 350cc inline 4 configuration was already a configuration that Honda had built. Honda's racing fame came when they started to build small capacity 4-cylinder motorcycles in the 1960s, and of all those race bikes, Soichiro's favorite was the 354 raced by the likes of Mike Halewood. Mr. Honda believed that this was the ultimate combination of speed, power, coupled with being lightweight and having a really high RPM. The CB354 was basically an homage to that motorcycle, a high-revving little race machine that in this case, as a production bike, the average rider could easily hop on and ride and sort of get to experience what a motorcycle like that really felt like. Innovation was the reason Honda became Honda. The innovation of the 60s, 70s, and 80s and on has carried into today, though one could argue that companies like Ducati and maybe Yamaha are really on the forefront of motorcycle innovation today. The reason Honda sells 20 million motorcycles a year now, currently, is because they built that reputation of making the absolute best, most advanced motorcycles over the last 60 years. And sometimes this means that you make a motorcycle that's either maybe too far ahead of its time, or that just doesn't land with the public, or maybe it's a motorcycle that just doesn't make sense. I like to put the 354 in the same camp as the CBR 250RR of the 1990s. Why did Honda build a 250cc literal race bike revving to 20,000 RPMs? Was it to make more money? Was it because it was the bike that made sense at that time? No. It was that Honda wanted to push the limits of what could be built. I think that the CB354 is the first of a certain kind of motorcycle. You know, riders talk about how it's more fun to ride a slow motorcycle fast fast than a fast motorcycle slow. And I think that's true, but there's another side to that. It's also fun to ride a slow motorcycle that feels fast, because not every slow motorcycle feels fast. Yeah, that's kind of obvious. But in this case, you don't have to beat the crap out of this slow motorcycle for it to feel fast. The appeal of a bike like this was the same as the appeal of the motorcycles Honda killed. My Triumph 500, for example, it's not a fast motorcycle, but because of the sound and the vibration, the bike feels fast. 50 miles per hour on my Triumph feels like 80 miles per hour on a modern, smooth motorcycle. The CB354 sounds nothing like a 350. It sounds like a big, fast, powerful motorcycle. So the appeal of the CB354 is no different than the appeal of, say, a Yamaha R3 or even a Ninja 400, a motorcycle that gives that vibe and that feel of a big, fast bike without the price tag or as much of the risk. Sometimes, though, motorcycles do make a comeback. Sometimes a certain bike will sit stagnant in a company's history, and sometimes it takes quite a long time for enthusiasts and riders to see its value. Think of the Harley-Davidson Knucklehead, an innovative, popular motorcycle for Harley in its day, but even just, a decade or more ago, Knuckleheads were being treated worse than a Yamaha in the hands of Maverick Vinales. People were just throwing them out. Now a running, even somewhat original Knucklehead can fetch $50,000, no problem. The CB354 is back in style now, recognized by enthusiasts as a true engineering marvel from Honda for its day, even though it was rare and undersold and only produced for a few years. I like to think of the CB354 in comparison to its twin brother, the regular CB350. By the way, that was Honda's best-selling motorcycle from this time. Anyways, I like to compare them the same way that I would compare something like the MV Agusta F4 750 of the late 90s to another inline 4 750 sport bike from the late 90s, the Suzuki GSXR 750. That F4 will never beat the GSXR in a race. It simply isn't faster, it weighs more, but man, the F4 just has something to it. It's got that it factor that only a motorcycle designed by someone like Massimo Tamburini can have. Yeah, you could say I'm a bit of a fan. This is my office. And like the F4, the CB354 was expensive to build and too expensive for the average rider. You can't always put a price on cool though, and if we're talking cool, you'd be hard-pressed to find a cooler motorcycle than the Honda CB354. To quote RM Rider Exchange, cruising down to the golf club in your Armani sunglasses and calfskin loafers was never more elegantly achieved than on board a CB354. When looking at classic motorcycles and what they have to offer to modern riders, it's no surprise that the CB354 is back in style. This was easily the most sophisticated small capacity bike of its day, and small Hondas are kind of in style these days. Incredibly smooth all the way through the rev range, the 354 is the perfect unmodern motorcycle for the modern rider. If you're interested in getting one, get in there now as they're skyrocketing in price, though some are going for like $4,000 to $5,000 in decent condition. A low mile example went for over $12,000 in Vegas last year at Mecum. That's pretty crazy. I did just recently see a pristine one for over $7,000 in California as well on Facebook Marketplace. Some of you may think it's crazy to spend that much on a little bike from the 70s, but here's the thing. That little bike will provide all the smiles and more that you can get from a modern Honda. It's got 10 times the looks, and as long as you take care of it, she's gonna go up in value instead of go down. Not a bad deal when you really think about it. The Honda CB354 may not have made sense in its day, but if you ask me, today it makes perfect sense.